So thank you for coming. So Vittorio asked me to give a sort of presentation of my book, Politics of Transindividuality, which is a lot to talk about. But I'm going to try and trace a particular trajectory around the way I'm approaching this concept of transindividuality as a particular kind of philosophical problem and philosophical practice. I'll begin by just giving a working definition of the concept, because I mean part of what interests me and part of what provoked this particular research is the way in which the notion of transindividuality appears in multiple texts, multiple problems, and often appears, perhaps maybe too quickly in some contexts, as a resolution to some long-standing problems without enough of its own particular basis or background developed. So for a beginning working definition, I will just take two kind of theses around the concept, especially as it's been articulated by Simondon. The first thesis is the notion that individuation must be understood as an ongoing process. In other words, rather think the problem of the individual and what constitutes an individual, to think the problem of individuation understood as a process rather than simply a product. And of course, you know, I'm not going to go into Simondon at great lengths. I'm going to talk more about Spinoza, Marx, and Balibar to some extent. In the Simondonian version, he's very interested in thinking about individuation in all of its possible registers, the individuation of physical things, of biological things, of the entire process of individuation. So for the first thesis, individuation is a process, not a product. And the second, and perhaps more important thesis for thinking about transindividuality, and not just individuation, is the extent to which the constitution of the individual and the collective is understood not as in terms of an opposition. In other words, and this is, I think, often the assumed ground on which individuation and collective are often thought about, especially in Anglo-American context, this notion that the more one belongs to or participates in some kind of collectivity, some kind of group, the less one is an individual. The more one is an individual, the less one is defined in relationship to particular collectivity. So it's often presented as a kind of zero-sum game in which the more one is an individual, the less one is collective, and vice versa. The very notion, and this goes to the title of Simondon's book, the very notion of transindividuation is, as he says, psychic and collective. Rather than see them as opposed, they are necessarily mutually constitutive. In other words, almost to put it sort of in a sort of Spinozist vocabulary, the individuation does not exist apart from the various collectivities which it participates in, and the various collectivities are nothing other than the processes of individuation that compose them. And so this definition, understood in terms of these two propositions, the process and the mutual constitution of the individual and collective, could already be understood as a kind of basis for some kind of social ontology, for some kind of understanding, which would in itself perhaps free us of some of the baggage and some of the problems with thinking in terms of some attempt to understand social and collective processes through individual choices and actions, like a social contract in which the only way you understand anything existing above or beyond the individual is as an effect of individual choices and actions, or on the flip side, the understanding of individuals is nothing other than products of some kind of holistic structure or institution. But what I'm interested in terms of talking about transindividuality, is thinking through what I call a critical conception of transindividuality, which means rather than take it as the basis for an ontology or social ontology, to think through the problem of transindividuality critically, and to some extent, part of what can be understood by this, and this is really the provocation I think put forward by Etienne Balibar primarily, in which he argues that this concept, transindividuality, like all philosophical concepts, they produce their own precursors. They produce a way of reading philosophers who have come before, and Balibar's suggestion that thinkers such as Spinoza, Hegel, Marx, Freud are the four that he sometimes focuses on, can be understood as trans-individual thinkers. And what interests me about taking, and I'm not going to try and take all of those, and I think any attempt to kind of construct this concept in relationship to one or more of those creates its own provocations and its own problems. But the interesting thing in terms of the book, I take up three: Spinoza, Hegel, and Marx. Although I'm going to focus primarily on Spinoza and Marx today. What interests me in terms of thinking about Spinoza and Marx as trans-individual thinkers is, as much as they articulate some kind of trans-individual thesis, they begin from the idea that we perceive the world first and foremost, and perceive ourselves in relation to the world first and foremost, not in and through these processes of individuation and the constitution of collective existence, but we perceive ourselves first and foremost as perhaps individually, right? If you take the thesis from the appendix of part 1 of Spinoza's Ethics, that we come into the world conscious of our desires and ignorant of the causes of things, right? So we are, in some sense, individuation, or ourselves as individuals, as kingdoms within a kingdom, is kind of the degree zero starting point of our own particular understanding of ourselves in the world. Right? So I would, in some sense, add to Spinoza's definition when Spinoza says we are conscious of our desires and ignorant of the causes of things. The ignorance that is most telling is we are ignorant of the causes of our own desires, in that sense that we take ourselves as the origin of our desires. And this is the thing that Spinoza talks about when he says things like the baby thinks it freely wants the milk, the drunk thinks he freely wants to drink, and so on. That is in some sense an ignorance of the process of one's own individuation, of taking oneself as the cause of one's own desires. Or, to say this more acutely in terms of Marx's understanding of what a critical conception of individuation would be. This is from the 1857 introduction, and to some extent this is the entire provocation of the argument developing in the book. This is in which Marx writes, "Only in the 18th century, in civil society, do the various forms of social connectedness confront the individual as a mere means towards his private purposes, as external necessity. But the epoch which produces this standpoint, that of the isolated individual, is also precisely that of the hitherto most developed, from this standpoint, general relations. The human being is, in the most literal sense, a political animal, not merely a gregarious animal, but an animal which can individuate itself only in the midst of society. Production by an isolated individual outside of society is as much of an absurdity as the development of language without individuals living together and talking to each other. And to some extent, I'm trying to read these two formulations together, despite their huge differences. Spinoza's formulation in the appendix of Part 1 of the Ethics, and Marx's formulation in the 1857 Introduction. What they have in common is the sense that as much as the individual takes itself as the starting point, as the ground of its own understanding and its own existence, it has to be seen as, in some sense, part of a process which exceeds it. Although, of course, Spinoza and Marx differ greatly in terms of what we are talking about in terms of this process, in the sense that, as Marx underscores in that passage, the individual, the bourgeois individual, is a historical product, and as he underscores, it is only in a highly developed, highly differentiated society, the division of labor, that one can see oneself as autonomous and separate from one's own social conditions. Once those social conditions have taken on a certain degree of abstraction and anonymity, then one can think oneself and conceive oneself as separate from and isolated from those conditions. But I think the common point of reference for both Spinoza and Marx, and also Hegel, in terms of this critical perspective, is in terms of three fundamental components. So, quoting myself here, if one wanted to characterize this general critical perspective on transindividuality, it could be described as having three moments. First, as a critical perspective, it begins from a spontaneous ideology that takes the individual as its starting point. This ideology is less a philosophical perspective developed in texts and arguments than a general worldview reinforced and disseminated by such perspectives as religion, in the case of Spinoza, or market relations, in the case of Marx. Second, it does not dispense with this starting point, arguing that the individual is not true, but rather critically excavates the practices and presuppositions that constitute its preconditions. Along these lines, it is not a matter of simply opposing the trans-individual to the individual as the true to the false, but of understanding the way in which the trans-individual encompasses and includes its own misrecognition. So, in the case of both Spinoza and Marx, there is the paradoxical thought, to some extent, is of the trans-individual constitution of the perspective of the isolated individual. I mean, in Spinoza, this has more of a general and almost ontological basis, in that being aware of our desires and ignorant of the causes of things is sort of how we come into the world. But I think if one reads closely the way in which the appendix of Part 1 of the Ethics is developed, in the way in which Spinoza articulates a certain thought of a kind of prejudice which is then reinforced by a kind of superstition, there's an extent to which this seemingly almost degree zero of our own, the first kind of knowledge is our own misrecognition of the conditions of our existence and the incorrect elevation of ourselves as kingdoms within a kingdom, as individuals prior to any relations, natural or social, that this spontaneous kind of philosophy is itself reinforced by the practices of religion, or what Spinoza calls superstition, as they articulate and reinforce the ignorance of the causes of our own desires, becoming a kind of feedback loop in which what is fundamental and basic to our understanding in the world becomes itself reinforced. But in some sense, I think what I mean by this critical perspective of transindividuality is, by critical, I'm taking exactly the lines of critique as Marx develops specifically in the German ideology, where the task is not simply, when Marx confronts sort of German idealism, the task is not simply to denounce it and say it's a false way of understanding the world, in the sense that consciousness determines life. When Marx says that life determines consciousness, it's not simply a matter of criticizing and denouncing this false view of the world. It is more a task of trying to understand how an inadequate conception of the world emerges from a particular set of social practices and relations, in the sense in which, as I read from the 1857 introduction, the extent to which Marx gives us the basis for an understanding of how it is that this kind of almost a paradox than a contradiction of how it is that in the midst of the most developed social relations, we get the perspective of the isolated, ahistorical individual can only be produced in and through those social relations. And the sense in which it takes the dissolution of particular forms of social belonging, in terms of belonging to a particular region, clan, etc., that make possible that kind of isolation. In some sense, I talk about this briefly to kind of give another philosophical point of reference for what Marx is saying. It's very interesting that in Descartes' Discourse on Method, he almost says the exact same thing that Marx says about the way in which a particular form of very developed social relations produce a particular image of a kind of autonomy and individuation. When Descartes sort of discusses the charms of living in Amsterdam and living in a city life, he says, there's a certain sense in which I'm completely anonymous. No one knows who I am, but at the same time, I have access to all sorts of the benefits of social relations. To some extent, that kind of asocial sociality is the product of market relations. Market relations would make it possible for one to get everything one needs in terms of the basic necessities of life without anyone ever having to know who you are. As Marx says elsewhere in the Grundrisse, with money one carries one's social bond in one's pocket. And that kind of abstract sociality produces, as a kind of after image, this idea of a particular kind of individuation or individuality. So the critical conception of transindividuality, rather than just simply assert, hey, we're all transindividual, it's all about these processes of individuation, the critical conception, as I'm trying to develop it, and why there's a merit and a need to read Spinoza and Marx as transindividual thinkers, what they offer, and to some extent what, I don't want to say this because it's almost scandalous, what Simon Mon doesn't, is precisely this way of thinking about about transindividuation in the sense that we don't begin, the first task for a philosophy of the transindividual is not simply the assertion of the transindividual basis of both individual and collective existence. The first problem for a transindividual philosophy is precisely the opposite, is that one has to begin from an account of why it is that the perspective of oneself as an autonomous individual, a kingdom within a kingdom, why that is the degree zero or the spontaneous philosophy. And the critique is not simply to assert, well, that's false, it's not the way things are, no one is an island, without social relations we would have no language, no habits, no comportments, no etc. It's not simply enough to say that, but it is a matter of saying it is precisely through the various practices and relations that are themselves trans-individual, in the sense that they are shared and defined by many, that we get this perspective of an isolated individual. Now, in saying that, in sort of tracing out the way in which we can read multiple philosophers as philosophers of trans-individuality, I do not want to simply assert that they're all saying the same thing and negate the important differences of the way in which they articulate this critical perspective of trans-individuality. And in some sense, it's the differences that become precisely interesting and important, and I'm going to articulate these differences in two ways. One is, and try to be less abstract about this, one is that in these different philosophers, and I'm like I said, I'm mainly going to focus on Spinoza and Marx here, the conditions of individuation are articulated in different ways. And I think in Spinoza, the two of the important differences, and here this is a very Balabarian way of reading Spinoza, is that in Spinoza one can argue that, I mean, obviously, and this is something that I'm not going to go into too much, obviously the primary ground of individuation in Spinoza is to some extent through the affects, in the sense that, and here we can employ another sort of Simondonian term that I think is important, in the sense that for Spinoza, the affects are the pre-individual. I mean, Simondon has this term, pre-individual, and it's a very strange, almost counterintuitive word. How could anything at all be pre-individual? And I think one way to illustrate that is precisely the way in which Spinoza talks about and writes about the affects, in the sense that, because Spinoza quite famously and geometrically gives us these very abstract definitions of, starting from joy and sadness as increases and decreases of one's capacity to act, and then as one reads through part 3 of the ethics, we get an increasingly compounded definition of the multiple ways in which joy, sadness, with their corresponding ideas of the causes of joy and sadness, which give us hatred and love, and the corresponding ambivalences in which hatred and love are combined in the hatred and love of the same object and situation. We get, obviously, where Spinoza ends part 3 of the ethics, where there really are as many different loves as there are objects to love, and as many different types of love as there are desires, as there are sort of striving individuals. And to some extent, that is an articulation of a process of individuation, right? That to some extent, love or joy and sadness are pre-individual, in that they are part of the constitution of every individual, although proper to no specific individual. But to understand a specific individuation is to understand the very different ways in which we have very different loves and hatreds, very different joys and sadness, right? As Balibar has developed this notion when he reads Spinoza's definition that desire is the very essence of man insofar as he's affected to desire a particular thing, that the combination of a sort of strange essence, right? 'Cause it's a very singular essence in the sense that desire does not unify us all together in some shared project or some shared definition of some kind of object of our desire in a Aristotelian sense that we all want the same good. It actually does quite the opposite. It differentiates us according to our own very specific and different desires. But that is, to some extent, a process of individuation. So in some sense, one could say that in talking about different philosophers as philosophers of the transindividual, that they have, on the one hand, different accounts of what individuates, and to some extent, the affects are primary. But the affects are not in the entirety of Spinoza. And I think there is a tendency in some contemporary Spinozist writing, I think to some extent, Frederick Laudon is guilty of this, of almost ripping out part 3 of the Ethics and making it the entirety of Spinoza's thought, in which it's all about affects, and the organization of the affects define the entirety of one's existence, and to leave out the other constitutive dimensions of collective and individual life in Spinoza, such as the imagination and reason. And here's the very Balibarian thesis that I want to talk about, in the sense that for Spinoza, both the individual and the state, as he refers to it briefly in the Ethics, and collective life, are defined by both imagination and reason. In the sense that ambition and reason are two different ways of the community preserving itself. Just as affects and reason, appetite and desires are two different ways of the individual preserving him or herself. That there is an overlap between the individual and the collective, the self and the city, is not surprising. After all, as we've seen with the idea of temperament, ingenium, the individual and the collective are constituted through the same basic relations, affects, ideas, and desires. However, such an understanding of society risks eclipsing the very trans-individual relation that we are seeking, that it risks making the individual nothing other than the effect of the city, the same affects, the same ideas on a smaller scale, or conversely, it makes the city nothing other than the projection of the different institutions that constitute it. Spinoza underscores the impossibility of this in at least two places. First, it's impossible to constitute a city entirely founded on superstition, on the imagination and the affects. To do so would require the total control of the experiences and ideas of all the individuals, to make all their imaginary associations and affective vacillations the same as the social imaginary. Right is coextensive with power, and every state must confront the irreducible singularity of the conatus of desires and ideas. There's an irreducible gap between the character, the ingenium of the individual, and that of collective. Attempting to annul it only makes it more powerful. Second, and conversely, a city is entirely founded on rationality is also impossible. The idea of such a city overlooks the finitude of man, the inability to know or control the future. Between these two extremes, between the constitution of total imaginary subjection and a free society of
of sages, states, and individuals are constituted as a combination of affective or imaginative and rational aspects. Or as Balibar puts it, sociability is therefore the unity of a real agreement and an imaginary ambivalence, both of which have real effects. We are always dealing with both affects, with ambition and reason, with a city founded on projection of our idea of man and a city founded on our rational utility. So, one way in which different philosophical accounts, focusing here on Spinoza and Marx, can be differentiated is in terms of how they think the ground of individuation. And I think for Spinoza, obviously one primary point is that of the affects, but another considered dimension is that of imagination, another considered dimension is that of reason. And I think one of the things that, and I think Balibar is right to focus on this in Spinoza, is there is to some extent both a kind of non-identity of these particular dimensions. When Balibar writes that every city is composed both of an imaginary identification and a rational agreement, that these two things kind of coexist at the same time without ever, and this is I think what strongly differentiates sort of a Spinoza's understanding of transindividuality from a more Hegelian understanding. And I think Hegel may not even belong as a transindividual thinker, and I think Balibar in some contexts is very ambivalent about including, sometimes positioning Hegel as more of a universalist than a transindividual thinker. Because in some sense, Hegel, like in the philosophy of right, has everything that you find, or the same point that Marx argues in the 1857 introduction, in the sense that Hegel has a very, understands that civil society is in some sense a kind of inadequate idea of individuals perceiving themselves as having their own isolated self-interest. It has nothing to do with the self-interest of others. And sort of this, the way you can read the philosophy of right is kind of this, almost this Bildungsroman, this trajectory in which you escape the family with its sort of both sustaining but also suffocating social bonds of an inability to separate out one's individual interest from one's collective interest. Like the family is defined by a certain relation of love in which the needs and desires of the other members cannot be radically separated or separated at all from one's own needs and desires. And when one separates that, moves out of that into civil society, one moves into this new kind of spontaneous philosophy, that of the isolated, self-interested individual. But where Hegel, I think, differentiates, especially from Spinoza or Marx on this point, is that for Hegel, the lesson of civil society is the lesson of a kind of recognition of the universal from the particular. That one eventually begins to understand that one's own isolated self-interest cannot be pursued on its own without some recognition of its constitutive relations to others. And to some extent, Hegel's very the lesson of civil society is one recognizes that you do need to worry about things like the maintenance of bridges and streetlights and the contamination of food, that the kind of isolated self-interest ends up, with self-destructive on its own point. And there's kind of this emergent lesson. I think that not only is that different from what we find in Marx, which we'll get into, but it's also different from what one finds in Spinoza. And I think Balibar's point about this kind of these two sociabilities, the imaginative and the rational, kind of coexisting as he reads that proposition 37 in part 4, as these two different ways of viewing the collective, that there is no telos, or progression, that these two, that the imaginary identification and the rational utility, nothing is more useful of man to man, that is the basis of collective existence. We need other individuals in order to be able to survive, and the sort of imaginary identification in which, you know, I coexist with others because I believe them to be like me, and that of course is highly ambivalent in Spinoza, because as much as I believe them to be like me, is the ground for some kind of shared collectivity. It's ambivalent. It's also the ground of some kind of hostility. And I think one of the interesting things about Balibar on Spinoza is that he reads Spinoza through his own research and thinking through questions of the nation and the citizen, and we see that ambivalence precisely in the way nationalist ideologies articulate themselves, in the sense that, you know, it is because the other comes here and wants what I want that they're going to destroy what I want, right? It's just that the imagination of other people being like me doesn't always constitute some kind of agreement. It actually constitutes some kind of basis for hostility. That as much as I imagine others to be like me, I also imagine them to want what I want and necessarily come into conflict with them because of that. One way to think the different articulations of transindividuality is in terms of the different constitutive relations, in the sense that we can think of affects as transindividual, imagination as transindividual, and also we can think of the constitution of rationality as transindividual. We can also think the constitution of the transindividual in terms of the different practices that constitute it. And here, turning now to Marx again, I think one can understand and read in Marx that not just, as in the 1857 introduction, which I quoted, there is the production of this this paradoxical, isolated individual from the most developed social relations, but I think, read more thoroughly, Marx understands, and of course this is a problem going back, and one interesting thing, of course, is that going back to Marx's earliest texts, you know, on the Jewish question, Marx really articulates, and there he doesn't yet have a concept of capital, and doesn't yet have a concept of the differential dimensions of capital, the market, the labor relation, etc. He just has this less nuanced and more Hegelian notion of civil society, but he does see civil society and the state, the bourgeois and the citizen, as two different individuations. But as that is developed in Marx's thought, we get, in capital, I think specifically, we get an articulation of there being two different individuations produced in and through the two different primary economic relations in capital. The first being the sphere of exchange, as Marx writes, the sphere of circulation or commodity exchange, within whose boundaries the sale and purchase of labor power goes on, is in fact a very Eden of the innate rights of man. It is the exclusive realm of freedom, equality, and Bentham. Freedom because buyer and seller of a commodity, let us say of labor power, are determined by their own free will. They contract as free persons who are equal before the law. The only force bringing them together and putting them into relation with each other is the selfishness, the gain, and private interest of each. And here, I think, going back to what I was saying about this critical conception, that Marx is not just saying that that is a false or inadequate conception of the individual, and he is saying that, but it has its own ground its basis in a particular set of practices, right? The sphere of exchange is a set of practices in which when one engages in, whether it be labor exchange, or I think more importantly, and I think the resonance of this passage are in terms of thinking how the market generates, not through a kind of complicated set of ideological mediations, but generates its own almost after image, a picture of not just commodities, as Marx argues in terms of fetishism. It produces our way of seeing things as things possessing value as an intrinsic property, but it also produces an image of the subjects entering into market exchange as free, autonomous, isolated. And this is an image that is, of course, inadequate, but it's not without its real basis, as Marx writes elsewhere in the Grundrisse about this basis. In the money relation, in the developed system of exchange, and this semblance seduces the Democrats, the ties of personal dependence, of distinction, of blood, education, etc., are in fact exploded, ripped up. At least, personal ties appear as personal relation, and individuals seem independent. This is an independence which is at bottom merely an illusion, and is more correctly called indifference, free to collide with one another and to engage in exchange within this freedom, but they appear thus only for someone who abstracts from the conditions of existence within which these individuals enter into contact. And these conditions, in turn, are independent of the individuals, and though created by society, appears as if they were natural conditions, not controllable by individuals. So, on the one hand, we have in Marx the idea that market relations, in their abstraction and isolation, produce a particular image or a particular spontaneous ideology of the way in which individuals participate in them as autonomous, isolated, as bearing no relation to one another except for the relations in which they freely enter into. That this is in some sense a product of these particular social relations. But on the other hand, we have in Marx, because that long passage that I cited with, it's one of the most rhetorically dense passages in Capital, which begins with Marx discussing, the sphere of circulation and its sphere of freedom, equality, and Bentham. Marx ends that same passage with, we now have to enter into the hidden abode of production. We now have to see that as we enter into the hidden abode of production, as Marx says, the capitalist and the laborer, they change they change almost in terms of, and it's one of the few places where Marx does engage with an affective dimension, and he says that as we enter into the hidden abode of production, the capitalist struts forward and the worker shrinks as one who has brought nothing to the market but is hide and has nothing to expect but a hiding or a skinning. That their status as equals fundamentally changes. And of course, one difference between the sphere of exchange and the hidden abode of production is precisely the change, in the sense that in the sphere of exchange, one enters into it as a kind of equal, money as one's social bond, and the money of this individual and that individual is treated fundamentally the same, right? That's the beauty of of the kind of spontaneous ideology of shopping. You know, you walk into a store, you have money, and your money is as good as anyone else. It doesn't matter how dirty or unkempt you are as you walk into the store, as long as the people operating the store think you have money, your money's as good as anyone else's money, and there is that kind of semblance of a kind of equality. But of course that dissipates when one enters into the fundamental market relation, the market relation of the labor market, in which then there are those who, of course, are selling their labor, and there are those, of course, who are buying their labor. And so the first difference between the sphere of exchange and the sphere, the hidden abode of production, as different practices that produce different individuations, is in terms of, in one, there's a kind of semblance of a kind of equality, and in the second, there's a kind of return of a certain kind of fundamental inequality, where it's fundamentally different to enter into the labor relation as one who has to sell their labor power versus one who is buying labor power. But that's not the only difference. As Marx says, in Capital as well, the individuation of the market is contrasted with the increased socialization of production. Capitalism does not just destroy the feudal relations of dependence and title, but it also destroys the isolated farmer and producer. And here, I was quoting Marx, whether the combined working day in a given case acquires this increased productivity because it heightens the mechanical force of labor or extends the sphere of action over a greater space, or contracts the field of production relatively to the scale of production, or at the critical moment sets large masses of labor to work, or excited rivalry between individuals and raises their animal spirits, or impresses on the similar operations carried on by a number of men the stamp of continuity and many-sidedness, or performs different operations simultaneously, or economizes the means of production by use in common. Whichever these is the case of the increase, the special productive power of the combined working day is under all circumstances the social productive power of labor, or the productive power of social labor. This power arises from cooperation itself. When the worker cooperates in a planned way with others, he strips off the fetters of his individuality and develops the capacities of this species, Gattungsvermögen, which is one of the few places in the Capital where Marx returns this notion of species. So Marx, and that's in the section on cooperation, and I think it's an important and in some sense puzzling formulation, because one of the curious things about that long paragraph is that Marx is almost kind of he wants to assert one fundamental proposition, and that is that the combined effect of different workers is necessarily greater than the sum total of their parts. But as Marx says in that long paragraph, he's fairly indifferent to what exactly the causal conditions of that increased combination are. And he enumerates whether it's the combined animal spirits, whether it's the sort of these tiny rivalries of competition that sort of drive one to produce more, or whether it comes through the more collective relations of cooperation. He's relatively indifferent, but the fact that Marx wants to assert there is that that unlike the sphere of exchange, which deals with isolated individuals, the sphere of production is always to some extent, a collective endeavor. And I think if one connects that formulation with other formulations that Marx makes about labor, like, for example, Marx's formulation, it's often quoted, that what differentiates the worst architect from the best of bees is that there's a necessarily mental component to any human labor. So if one thinks about that necessarily mental component, which I would argue is also a necessarily collective component, then I think the important assertion about Marx and the individuation produced in and through the hidden abode of production is that labor is always collective. And in fact, Balibar says this as well, and Balibar says that if we want to read the proposition about the combined effort of the species to its necessary logical and radical conclusion, is that it is a profoundly anti-Lockean formulation at the core of Marx's argument, and that whereas Locke saw labor as the basis of property, that moment when you combine your own body with the raw material, right? That moment in Locke when Locke says, at what point does the apple picked from the tree become the property of the one who picks it? Is it the moment when you bite it and begin to combine your saliva with it, or is it the moment? It's always that profoundly that Locke, I think, the moment of the kind of like cafeteria in Locke's theory of labor and property. I don't know if it's true across in other cultures and contexts, but I always remember when you used to fight over who owned a cookie, who had the last cookie, with your siblings or whatever. The way to solve that debate is grab that cookie and just lick it. Because then at that moment, the property relation is entirely decided. No one wants it. But of course, Locke would go a step further. It's not the combination of the saliva and the cookie that makes it your property, but it's actually the moment of grabbing it. And that moment of grabbing it, the moment you combine your labor with the raw material, it becomes yours. Right? And of course, Locke wants to see labor as, and necessarily has to see labor as this entirely individuated process. Right? At the exact moment that one combines the effort of one's body, right? Because the body is that kind of it's that startup capital we all come into the world with, right? That your body is properly yours. Everything is owned in common, but the body is yours. And so the moment you combine your bodily effort with any kind of raw material, it becomes your property. Now, Marx's thesis, I think, or the way that Marx is asserting the necessarily species nature of labor is profoundly different. It's not just that Marx is saying, because I mean the chapter on cooperation, Marx is discussing the factory, right? And of course, and the extent to which capital necessarily, for its own sort of economy of scale, necessarily finds itself that it is more productive and more profitable to bring a group of individuals together under the same structure, have them work together, and through their combined efforts, you produce a surplus which is always going to be greater than the sum of its parts. But as Balibar has suggested, if we want to read Marx and trace out the kind of philosophical anthropology at work in Marx, then one has to assert that it's not just when one is in the factory combining the efforts of individuals that one is engaging in labor as a trans-individual rather than individual process. But even when I labor alone, in the extent to which, even in isolation, I'm utilizing thoughts and ideas that define my habits and practices, those thoughts and ideas are necessarily transindividual. And to add to this, if I utilize any implement, any tool, that tool is, of course, not only the product of other labor processes, but even to some extent how I hold that tool, even the extent to which the way in which I hold a pen is itself something which has been, not only is the pen as a tool a product of another labor process, but the extent to which even when I write in my own most intimate and innermost thoughts and I engage with the way of comporting and holding the pen, which is itself something that has been taught to me and in a process of education, that to some extent, Althusser, that famous formulation, a communist never thinks alone. I think to some extent we could say that in Marx, it's based off of this assertion in Marx that not only does a communist, but no one ever works alone, and that every labor process, even the isolated individual out, the Locke's famous servant cutting his turfs, that servant, insofar as that servant engages with a tool, I don't know what tool you use to cut turfs, some kind of tool to cut turfs, and engages in some kind of way of cutting turfs, is engaged in a necessarily transindividual process. So, to some extent, we could see that, coming from Marx, then, we could see that there is both an individuation produced in and through the sphere of exchange, and an individuation produced in and through the sphere of production, and they are, in some sense, can be understood in some sense to be opposed. The first, through the sphere of exchange, is one of isolated, self-interested individuals who are in some sense equal. The sphere of production is that of necessarily collective individuals who are in some sense, at least with respect to the capitalist, are in some sense unequal and are necessarily collective. And of course, we could say that that as much as Marx gives us the basis for seeing the sphere of exchange, the sphere of production, as different individuations, one could argue that, of course, both these individuations have to be understood as historically. I mean, in the sense that, that passage in Marx about the sphere of exchange, and it's a very insightful passage, which is why, people have returned to it again and again, because it almost, this is the way that say, Frederick Jameson writes about it, it almost sort of explains the persistence and basis of sort of libertarian ideologies, right? What are libertarian ideologies based off of? They take one aspect of the capitalist relation, the market relation, the sphere of exchange, they take it as the totality, and they take its constituent dimensions, the idea that everyone is, freedom, equality, and Bentham, and they say this is what capitalism is, of course ignoring that capitalism cannot function without production and without the relations in production, and they take the part as the whole, and that is where they get their apology for capital. But of course, the flip side is necessarily true. Why these sort of libertarian or neoliberal ideologies are so persistent is that in some sense, they are the spontaneous ideologies of market relations themselves, in that they take not so much the market understood as a labor market, because that I think still has, it's hard to really make the labor market a basis for freedom and equality, even though hardcore libertarians will insist that if you don't like the working conditions here, you can always go someplace else. But I think the real seduction of the kind of individuation in the market comes not from the labor market, but comes from the consumer market. Right? That's where it gets its real affective basis. But of course, as much as Marx's assertion of freedom, equality, and Bentham as the kind of after images of the sphere of exchange has a real continues to have a contemporary relevance, it's also important to recognize, historically speaking, that Marx was writing this really before the emergence of a consumer society as we understand it, in the sense that this is, of course, any attempt to read contemporary consumerism in Marx always comes up against real limitations. You always find this difficult, or I always find this difficulty in teaching Marx when you talk about commodity fetishism. One of the interesting things is that everyone thinks they know what commodity fetishism means, but they always think it means things like being overly attached to brands and logos, and of course that Marx could not have possibly meant that, because those things didn't really exist circa 1867. And every time you find Marx talking about commodities and capital, it's worth pointing out how dull and banal his commodities are. They're corn, linen, and coats, and they don't offer the same kind of seductions that contemporary consumer society offers. So, to some extent, and this is I'm not going to go into this now. This is something that I talk about in the book. Some of the contemporary interests in transindividuation as a way of theorizing a contemporary critique of capital. I mean, a lot of what is happening in, say, the work of someone like Paulo Virno or the work of someone like Bernard Stiegler is that they have tried to think through on both sides of the division that Marx articulates. On the one hand, you have in the work of Paulo Virno saying, well, okay, yes, Marx did say that the sphere of production was necessarily one in which one engages with the collective powers of mankind's species, but that has been radically transformed in the contemporary production process, where it's not so much a matter of a bunch of, what Marx was thinking of, a bunch of workers in the factory sort of, working in unison with each other, sort of, where the collective powers of the species are the kind of rhythms that become possible as one works together collectively and begins to kind of engage in the same process and sort of use the collective energy to kind of increase one's productive process. But when Virno says we need to historicize precisely what the social individual in Marx might mean today, he means the modern production process where things like communication and discussion and even the use of language, have become more and more central in the production process. I think one of the interesting things about, Virno's take, in contrast to some of the discussions of immaterial labor in, say, Lavorato or even in Negri, I think one of the interesting things about Virno's understanding of the increased powers of social cooperation is that he really wants to separate it from any idea of a privileged sector of the production process, and wants to stress when he asserts, that the general intellect is the intellect in general, he wants to assert that even lowly things like working retail, in the sense that, even managing a small shop working retail, one has to communicate in novel situations and confront, even dealing with customers, some unprecedented situations, in the sense that anyone who's worked retail knows you never quite know what the hell people want from you and how to deal with them. And the social cooperation is not to be found in some highly sort of remunerated part of the production process, but is to be found sort of disseminated throughout the production process in terms of any place in which people have to speak, talk, and communicate. This cooperation is being utilized. And furthermore, we could argue that the flip side of the economic processes, the sphere of exchange, which Marx articulates as freedom, equality, and Bentham, has itself been radically transformed by the emergence of a consumer society, and to some extent, and I don't want to go too into this, but this is something we can discuss. And I have a lot of issues and problems with Stigler and his understanding of Marx and understanding of capitalism, but I think one of the things that he is interesting on is the extent to which his assertion that you cannot go to modern consumer society as it exists and expect to find these kind of free, autonomous individuals that even Marx was willing to acknowledge in the sphere of exchange, because in that modern consumer society functions in and through the necessary, constant production of not so much autonomous individuals, but as individuals who are increasingly looking to define themselves in relationship to the commodities they consume, which, in order for that to be a successful and marketable dimension of capital, must necessarily be one fraught with anxiety and inadequacy, right? I mean, if anything that was being marketed, everything from soap to clothing, if it truly produced the satisfactions that the commercial or the advertising promises, it would be a fundamental failure as a commodity, in the sense that if one bought it and found oneself truly as happy and content as one was supposed to be, then one would never buy another item of clothing again, and the consumer society would necessarily collapse. So consumer society only functions by constantly dangling a kind of carrot of satisfaction, but then constantly moving that object away, in the sense that a consumer society cannot be, and this is something that Stigler insists on, that he thinks, as he argues, he thinks that the smug satisfaction with which some liberal philosophers say we are living in an individualistic society is just patently false, in the sense that a society in which individuals are constantly looking to their practices of consumption and what they buy to define themselves and shape who they are is not an individualistic society at all. It is a profoundly de-individuated society in which one must constantly shore up one's sense of individuation through one's consumption. I mean, it's a strange, and it's almost funny the extent to which, I mean, if you think about, and this goes back to, and I think Sigler's right by pointing to the Frankfurt School on this point, that the idea of individuating oneself through consumption is a kind of self-annulling proposition, because by definition one is going to buy things which are sold on the market to others, and one is never going to be able to buy that unique identity one is seeking to consume, because it's always going to be made up of someone else. You're always going to risk showing up at the party wearing the same shirt as someone else. So on that level, it is fundamentally self-negating, but it is also self-negating in the sense that it necessarily presupposes that one has to constantly redefine. To realize oneself through consumption is to be engaged in a kind of infinite Sisyphean task of constantly looking to find one's own unique identity in a process which must necessarily deny it to you but promise it to you yet again time, or the next thing you're going to consume. So one can both historicize both sides of the sphere of exchange and the sphere of production. But I think, and this is where I'm trying to go with this, is that to put these two ways of formulating transindividuality together, so on the one hand, as I argued with respect to Spinoza, one has to think of transindividuality of having itself encompassing different aspects of individuation, in that it entails affects, imagination, and reason. So individuation is different in terms of its different pre-individual components, affects, imagination, and reason. And these things necessarily coexist and coexist differently. I mean, I think one of the strengths of Spinoza's analysis for a social theory is that not only are each of us, in the sense that we are individuated, we have our different affective compositions, in the sense that we all have our different joys and sadness, our own different loves and hates, and our own different ambivalences that define our particular character, ingenium, our own particular comportment. And at the same time, every historical moment, Spinoza uses this word state, but I think we can flesh it out and say that every historical moment, every collectivity has its own particular imagination, its own particular affective dimensions as well, and that these different components, the affective, the imaginative, and the rational, not only necessarily coexist differently, right? I mean, I think that even though there is no telos in Spinoza, in the sense that there is no process by which the collective becomes more rational, and there is no process by which necessarily the individual becomes more rational. I mean, seeing the better and doing the worse remains a kind of insurmountable horizon for each of us. One of the hard Spinoza's lesson of getting older is you never stop seeing the better and doing the worse. You never entirely escape the realm of inadequate ideas in the imagination. So that, on the one hand, we can think together these different components coexisting, and that at every given, just for every individual and at every given historical moment, there's a different articulation of the affects, of the imagination and reason. And at the same time, those different articulations have to be related to the different social practices and social spheres. I mean, here with Marx, I've been focusing on exchange and production as two different practices and two different spheres, each of which produce their individuations in different ways. Although one would also have to add, and I didn't talk about this enough, but to some extent, the sphere of politics is also its own sphere of individuation, and one sees this in contemporary theorists of transindividuality in terms of politics have articulated this in different ways, and in fact, the three major contemporary theorists of transindividuality that I discuss, Balibar, Stiegler, and Virno, all articulate this in fundamentally different ways, in the sense that I think for Balibar, and I think he still wants to insist on this, the citizen is has to be understood as itself a particular mode of transindividual individuation, in that it necessarily is both a recognition of right. The citizen has to be recognized as necessarily collective, in that one can never just be a citizen alone. There have to be fellow citizens to recognize and articulate the basis of that individuation. But it also is itself individuated. And I mean, one of the interesting things, and this is something that I've tried to think through and understand, is the extent to which, speaking about Balibar, is that Balibar is both, on the one hand, profoundly interested in transindividuality, but he also articulates this concept of equilibrity. And to some extent, there's a strong resonance between the two. Right? Equilibrity in this understanding of not seeing equality and liberty as opposed, right? The classic, very ideological, kind of Cold War residue that is, I think, very entrenched still in the way that political philosophy is talked about and discussed, is this notion that you can either have equality and not liberty, right? And I think this is the resonance, especially is the way in which a lot of our thinking about the 20th century has been sort of refracted through dystopian literatures and so on, in which there's always these nightmares of equality without liberty, of everyone wearing the same gray jumpsuit, and the necessary suppressions of individual differences and hierarchies that are necessary to make a society of equals. Or you can have liberty without equality, in the sense that any society that recognizes freedom is going to necessarily recognize the consequences of free choices and decisions, which lead to profound inequalities and so forth. And of course, Balibar's point about equilibrity is to argue against both of these formulations and to say that every denial of equality necessarily denies liberty, and every denial of liberty necessarily denies equality. And so equilibrity has a kind of resonance with transindividuality, but of course the interesting thing is that it's articulated in Balibar on a political rather than ontological register, right? When he says how to prove equilibrity, he just simply says, well, look at all those situations where there is an attempt to have equality without liberty or have liberty without equality. Doesn't it ultimately end up effacing the very equality without liberty ends up annulling liberty, and liberty without equality ends up annulling equality without liberty ends up annulling equality as well. The classic illustration of this is a society which supposedly has equal rights, say, of speech and so on, or liberty to speak without any possible attentiveness to equality, which has taken on ludicrous dimensions in the United States with the understanding of money as speech. It ends up, you end up with freedoms that effectively do not exist, because without any equality necessary to make them possible, they just end up being vacuous promises and so on. But anyways, one can understand politics, the citizen, too, as a trans-individual individuation. And here, just scoping out the horizon of different contemporary transindividual thinkers, it's interesting to note that on the one hand you have Balibar, who still, I think, is attached to the figure of the citizen, especially the citizen as it separates itself from the more imaginary identification of the nation. Right? I think this is Balibar's. When Balibar says, with respect to Spinoza, every community, every sociability is both an imaginary identification and a real agreement. The contemporary articulation of that is the way in which, for Balibar, every existing nation is defined both as citizen and nation. Right? Citizen understood as this equilibral sort of promise that is not at all attached to any shared language, cultural tradition, habit, etc. Right? That it is necessarily abstract and necessarily equilibral in its openness and indifference to any, what Balibar would call, anthropological difference, so that there's always that dimension to modern nation states, the dimension of the citizen, which necessarily is indifferent to shared cultural habits, languages, traditions, etc. But every nation also defines itself in relationship to some shared imaginary of the nation, which has its corresponding idea about what a particular American or Italian looks like, talks like, etc. And those two dimensions are always in necessarily conflict. So the political sphere can be itself defined as having both an imaginary and rational dimension. But of course, the political sphere cannot be understood apart from capital and economic relations. And of course, here, to juxtapose briefly, Balibar's thought would say Stigler and Virno on this point. On the one hand, I think Stigler's pessimism is that citizens don't exist anymore. I mean, this kind of collective, the capacity of an I that is a we and a we that is an I, to put it in that Hegelian formulation, has been utterly destroyed by the rise of consumer society, and a consumer society, as Stigler understands it, is one which never really articulates a we, because there is no we in owning the same shirt or driving the same car. It's there's no individuation there. And there's no I either in Stigler's sense, in the sense that this goes back to the constant denial of individuation through an individuation for consumers in and through consumption, that as much as consumption promises us to find the proper tastes, habits, fashion, style that would truly individuate us and make us who we truly want to be, it necessarily has to constantly deny that at the same time in order for it to function as a market. Because if you ever truly found the coat that defined you as an individual, you would stop buying coats, and that would be a disaster economically speaking. So Stigler, I think, sees the destruction of the economic by the destruction of the political individuation by the economic, and in contrast to this, one could say that Virno's position is precisely the opposite of Stigler, in the sense that Virno's position is, in a sense that Virno situates himself with a kind of updating of Arendt's thesis, right? Arendt's fear was that the sphere of action, with its necessary plurality, uncertainty, and so forth, is going to be effaced by the instrumentality and teleology of work, that Arendt's idea, which is not entirely foolish, in a sense that modern political campaigns are structured much more, engineered much more like the design of advertising and product lines, right? They are tested, they are engineered, they are orchestrated in the same way to generate a particular result, in the same way that before we ever see an advertisement for a soft drink or a product, that advertisement has been shown to test audience, and it's been tested to have the right results. A political campaign is exactly the same way. It's a product. Whereas Arendt was concerned that the instrumentality of work was going to face the realm of production. Virno's position is precisely the opposite, that in and through the labor process, we engage in a necessarily much more communicative, relational, that even showing up at a store to sell products, we necessarily engage in our capacity to communicate, our capacity to deal with uncertain situations, that the public realm hasn't been sort of destroyed by capital. Instead, its qualities have been turned into the qualities of the labor process. So Virno's position is that of almost of a slumbering, latent, kind of possible new public sphere, which is being articulated in and through our engagements, not only with work, but also with consumption, and that we communicate and use our communicative capacities in and through things like social media, that public sphere only needs to kind of come forward, and it can be this basis for a non-state public sphere. But I think rather than sort of choose in terms of this thinking through the relationship between the individuations of the economic and the political, I think, and here's where things get really complicated, in the sense that not only is there always simultaneously at the same both political and economic processes of individuation. The economic, of course, splits into two, as it were, in the sense that it entails both relations of exchange and the consumer aspect with its own corresponding way of articulating and developing a particular individuation. And it entails, of course, the sphere of production as well, which entails its own dimensions of individuation. In other words, to put it somewhat simply, one is never solely a citizen, solely a consumer, solely a worker. One is always simultaneously citizen, consumer, and worker. That these different individuations necessarily overlap and intersect, although not. I think that the usefulness of someone like Stiegler or Virno is that they in some sense what they're trying to develop is the way in which one of those individuations necessarily encompasses and effaces the others, right? That for Stiegler, for example, the consumer has entirely destroyed the citizen and the worker, and that we've all become sort of these passive, desiring pawns of the consumer society, incapable of articulating a sense of an I or a sense of a we. And someone like Virno would say, no, the worker, in that the worker has become the site of the social individual, utilizing increasing dimensions of social consumption. The worker has effaced the consumer and the citizen. I would say that it is necessary to think the fundamental overdetermination of these different individuations, in that they are always necessarily coexisting in each of us, that we each are attempting to articulate and make sense of our individuations in and through our specific work processes that define us and shape us, in and through our particular consumption processes that define us and we're used to individuate ourselves, and in and through our particular political dimensions. But so we have on the one hand we have those three different dimensions coexisting, but I would also add that each of those dimensions have their own corresponding or each of those different practices or individuations have their own corresponding affective and imaginative and rational components. I mean, one way of thinking about this, and of course, I mean, when I'm ultimately thinking through this as a kind of overdetermination, or to use Simondonian vocabulary, the metastability, right, that these things coexist in necessarily tense and complicated ways, in ways that because I think the basis for thinking metastability in Simondon is a sense in which, in the physical processes of metastability, we are confronting with something that is tense, defined by its tensions, but at any given moment it can be tipped in one direction or another. Right? At any given moment, a given individual might gravitate towards one aspect of their individuation or another, right? That at a given provocation, you might suddenly decide to see yourself first and foremost as a worker, or first and foremost as a citizen or belonging to political, or you might see yourself first and foremost as a consumer, right? This is something that Laudon, I think, both gets but doesn't get when he says that. And I think he has an interesting point when he says that, in contemporary capitalist society, we are, in some sense, interpolated primarily as consumers, in the sense that, his way of illustrating this, if you look at the way in which a strike is covered in the media and in the news, the primary point they go to is, how is this going to affect travelers or consumers, right? The railroads are on strike. How is this going to affect tourism, consumers, right? The primary question is that of, first and foremost, the identity of oneself as a consumer. The fact that a strike always necessarily involves workers and is being articulated because of working condition is almost effaced, in the sense that because of course that is how, of course, the capitalist press wants to produce it, because that, of course, produces the most intolerance of strikes. This is inconveniencing me. This is making it difficult for me to travel. This is going to hurt my business, etc., and so forth. So that at any given moment, one of these individuations takes precedent. But at the same time, we have to think of these different individuations as being composed of their necessarily affective, imaginative, and rational components. To illustrate that, I mean, if you think about what is being discussed and understood by this notion of, say, precarity, right? And the precariousness of labor relations. And some people have tried to articulate, the sense of in the sense of guys standing, is the precaria a new kind of political, economic identity? And I think one way to think about precarity is it's not so much a new economic class, because I think it's hard to unify together the various different dimensions of precarity, from the migrant worker who from day in to day out doesn't know where they're going to work and so forth, to the professor on a limited contract who has to, year from year, has to renegotiate that contract and so forth. But I think one of the ways to make sense of what is meant by precarity is we're talking primarily about the affective dimension of the labor. It's not, you're still doing the same work, and the labor relations themselves haven't changed, but it's this pervasive sense of fear and anxiety that even those who have some degree of job security are constantly being sort of told in one way or another, your job could be shipped overseas, your job could be changed. It's the affective dimension of the labor relation, so that each of these aspects, the economic, the political, the economic, divided in two in terms of the worker and the consumer, the spheres of exchange and the spheres of production. Each of them have an economic, each of them have their own particular imagination. And another way to think about this in terms of to some extent, what is one way to understand neoliberalism is not only, as I've sort of already mentioned, is its ability to take one part of the economic totality, the sphere of exchange as the whole, right, to understand everything based on market relations. But it also does so in terms of, its way of extending itself over the totality. How can you understand work through the lens of market relations? Is its way of producing a particular imaginary, in the sense that the imaginary is, rather than see oneself as a worker engaged in a necessarily collective and shared process, one is encouraged to see oneself as a kind of reservoir of human capital, as a kind of factory of one, in which it is not so much that one necessarily is engaged in a shared and collective process of production where you're doing the same thing as others, but one is necessarily engaged as a highly individuated process of production where you have to, in every situation, think about what you need to do to differentiate and maximize your human capital with respect to everyone else. So much so that you almost get the ideology almost produces the very kind of individuated and isolated process that is that previous philosophies said were the labor process, right? That to some extent, and of course, neoliberalism is both a practice and an ideology in that way, right? That if one is working as on a temporary contract through through a staffing or temporary work situation, that to some extent that practice does produce the effects of a kind of individuation, isolation, and competition. If you know how to do something and your fellow workers do not, there's a certain sense in which you are kind of compelled to treat that bit of knowledge as your own scarce resource, which should not be shared. But it also, at the same time, cannot be disassociated from its own ideology or its own imagination. So, these three different spheres, the consumer, the citizen, and the worker, each have their own different dimensions, affective, imagination, and rational, and they all necessarily combine in different ways. So much so that, one can, just like the very concept of a kind of overdetermination, which is really what I'm discussing here, can only be thought from a specific site and location. But I think the important thing about thinking these different individuations through the concept of transindividuality is not just that it allows us to kind of have a very specific and focused, so we can talk about at any given historical moment, at every given social formation, the way in which these different individuations intersect, combine, and transform each other. And we can then produce different theories of different subjectivities specific to different situations. I mean, that is one aspect. But it's, to some extent, we have to recognize that the subjectivity itself is only part of the process. The process exceeds the subjectivity. And I think one of the interesting things about thinking politics from transindividuality is that it compels us to think through, because I think that, the basis, I think, of any, or at least my thought of transindividuality is that articulating on the basis in a situation in which there is the predominance of highly individuated and highly isolated ideologies and political imaginaries. And so I think one of the basis of, or one of the positive dimensions of thinking transindividuality is that it compels us to see the shared and collective grounds of those highly individuated ideologies, even when the end result is isolation and fragmentation. I mean, one of the interesting things about, say, for example, a prevailing sense of precarity or austerity, the sense that that at any day I could lose my job, and any day, is that it is a common condition which is often articulated in highly individuated and competitive ways. Right? It's a shared condition, but the way people experience that shared condition is not to say to each other, by and large, right now, at least in our story that we're living through right now, is not to say to each other, you are nervous and have anxiety about your job and your situation. I do too. Let us make that shared sense of anxiety the basis of a shared political and economic project. Let's try to transform the cause of that anxiety. That often the effect of that shared identity is to, rather than that it become the basis of a transformative collective identity, is that we have the same anxiety, but it leads me to look to you and say, how can I have some kind of advantage over you? Or how can I make sure maybe you're excluded from the conditions of work based on your, here's where the political imaginaries of nation and so forth intersect. How can I exclude you and perhaps make my economic condition better? So as much as I think that part of the political impact of a politics of transindividuality is it compels us, I think, to recognize that at our basis, our differentiated and isolated and competitive subjectivities have as their basis the same affective dimensions, the same fears, anxieties, and hopes, the same shared practices and imaginative dimensions, and the same and possibly the same. So I haven't said a lot about the third aspect, the rational aspect, because I think part of what the rationality is, in Spinoza's sense, of precisely, I mean, that common notions as the basis of rationality are both notions that are shared, because to know something is to think something in the same way, but they're the notions themselves shared, but they're also notions of our commonality. Right? The more we apprehend and grasp that we are in some sense, going back to that quote from the 1857 introduction, I mean, the paradox of our existence, I think, now in contemporary capitalism is that the very conditions that define our common existence, our common anxieties, our shared social imaginaries, and so forth, are conditions that can only be lived in forms of isolation, fragmentation, etc. And so the task of a politics is, in some sense, to make that commonality express itself in a sort of adequate idea. I mean, and I think in recent history, I mean, we've seen moments of that in the sense that, I mean, to take the political movements in the U.S. that were unified under the terms Occupy Wall Street, were in some sense the attempt to articulate these conditions of economic precarity, indebtedness, uncertainty of any kind of possible future, and rather see them as the basis of increasing attempts to kind of competitively seek out some kind of advantage. They became, for a brief moment, articulated around a shared we. We are the 99%, a shared. I mean, it was a very inchoate and not very rigorously economically analyzed we, but there was at least in the articulation of a kind of we, and that was often more at the level of affect and imagination than ideas, right? Because there was less of a concrete notion of what was meant by that as a concept than there was a strong sense of a kind of indignation, of anger, frustration, and that is often easier to articulate the affective dimensions of transindividuality. As we see all around us now, there's a great deal of rage, frustration, and indignation. The affects are shared, but the problem with a purely affective dimension of transindividuality is that it can always be shifted into reactionary and populist imaginaries. And so the challenge is to articulate the affective into not just a kind of imaginary, but also to construct a new kind of conceptual knowledge of our economic and political situation that can transform the transindividual basis into the ground of a kind of politics. So I'm going to leave it there for discussion, if that's. Thank you.